64! Oh my god, Nintendo 64! Oh my god, Nintendo 64! There's your gratuitous Nintendo 64 shot.
We get supersonic racing, running to the point of no return. Everybody supersonic racing, come on, let the fire burn.
The holidays are particularly an odd time of year. It's a time where people go out in below 30-degree weather to go singing, when people stress themselves out trying to go somewhere or go into debt buying a gift. But for me growing up, it meant I got to watch different Christmas specials, from Frosty the Snowman, Merry Christmas Charlie Brown, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer Gets Bullied by Santa, and various others, but that's for another day. And the holidays also meant I got different gifts, such as different TV shows and movies on VHS, Blu-ray, or DVD. Really showing my age there. But the holidays also meant getting video games. One example would be the Sega Genesis with a bunch of games, including one of my favorites of all time, Sonic 3 and Knuckles. And there was also the Sony PlayStation, which didn't have a definitive mascot per se, but it introduced me to quite a lot of few games, such as Jersey Devil, the Spyro games, Crash Bandicoot, Final Fantasy IX. There's other consoles I've gotten during the holidays growing up, such as the Sony PlayStation 2, the Sega Dreamcast, the GameCube, the Xbox 360. So there's still a lot of consoles I enjoy heavily to this day that I've gotten over the holidays. But there's one in particular I want to talk about, and that is the Nintendo 64. Originally known as the Ultra 64, the Nintendo 64 was released in 1996, and until the Nintendo Switch came out, it was the last of the home consoles to support cartridges. I only vaguely remember this console coming out, as I was distracted by the likes of the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and the Sony PlayStation. But after one trip to my cousin's house, I was convinced. A Super Mario game with graphics comparable to Crash Bandicoot? How could I not be hooked? I was jealous, but not too long after, in 1998, there was one waiting for me under the Christmas tree, along with some games. First, let's take a look at the console itself. I find it to be very smooth looking, and honestly, compared to the Super Nintendo's first design, I actually like this much better. Fun thing about the N64, similar to the Game Boy, it came in various colors, and I believe it's the first home console to do something like this. The ones I remembered most were the gray, the watermelon color, jungle green, and there was a Pikachu one that I always wanted to own, but the one I currently have is the Arctic Blue, which is my personal favorite. And their color choices also extended to the controllers themselves. And I know everyone keeps making memes and jokes about the controller design, but honestly, I find it to be rather comfortable in my hands. Yeah, there are a lot of buttons, but I never really needed to use them all in one game. Well, usually. There was also a slot on the controller for the rumble pack and the memory card, which I never used growing up. I get having a game vibrate according to what's going on screen. It was actually a very cool feature at its time, but I was fine without it. And the same could be said about the memory card, because most of the games I had growing up had an internal save. As for the problems I had with the N64, most of it came to the packaging. Like the Super Nintendo and NES before it, N64 games came in cardboard boxes. Honestly, I don't understand why they didn't go with hard cases by this point, but this choice makes it hard to find nice condition boxes for games. Well, unless you find it sealed. Speaking of condition, remember the sleeves that the Super Nintendo and NES games had? The N64 cartridges don't have anything like that. Why not? I think one of the worst problems of the N64 was the lack of end labels. Like the angry video game nerd, I never liked this choice. It's a pain when it comes to shopping for loose N64 games, or even when you're organizing your collection. Now I know in Japan most Famicom and Super Famicom games lack end labels, but for your third console, again I ask, why not? Thankfully, you could go to sites like Etsy or eBay to get custom end labels. Well, with that out of the way, let's go into the games. As Pat the NES Punk would say, the console is only as good as the library of games it has. So, let's begin with some of the Nintendo licensed titles. So before I go any further, I want to clarify something. This video is my personal retrospect on the console, so if there's a game that you probably grew up with and I didn't talk about in this video, I do apologize now. With that said, I'm not going to talk about games like Banjo-Kazooie or Banjo-Tooie, Donkey Kong 64, or any of the Zelda games. These are games I grew up with, but I don't want to skimp out on any details, like I am going to with a lot of games on this list. And another thing, I'm also limited to the games I currently own in my collection, so even if I had it growing up, if I don't have it now, I can't talk about it. Let's begin. Super Mario 64. Well, like most people who have this console, this was one of the first games I started out with. And honestly, it really defined 3D platforming, especially on this console, which many try to imitate but few successfully duplicate it. Each Mario Mario game had gotten better from the first Super Mario Bros. To Super Mario World. Clearly, this was no exception. It was weird that you jumped into these paintings to enter a new stage, but the stages themselves are the best thing about this game. The stages in the Mario games are always excellent, for the most part, but for the first time, it was a bit more open-ended, mostly revolving around collecting stars, which can be outright painful sometimes. And there's that soundtrack, which is one of my favorite Mario soundtracks ever for the right reasons. There's Yoshi's Story, which is something I like to call a relaxer game, as the entire atmosphere is just soothing to me. The best way I sum up this game is imagine if Yoshi's Island didn't have Baby Mario. Now that doesn't make it a cakewalk either, but I definitely like choosing a Yoshi between each level. I mean, who wouldn't want blue or pink? And the first game I ever played on the N64 was Star Fox 64. Now I never owned the original Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, at least before I played this game. It was something I dabbled with at a friend's house often, and it was quite fun, but that one trip to my cousin's house blew me away. It was basically like playing a full-on Star Wars game, well before the Star Wars games came out on the N64. It was nice to hear actual voices as opposed to it's a game that was so good that Nintendo kept having to repackage this game basically. Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2 are games I've already done on this channel before, and some of my opinions still stand, with it being kind of dull unless you have a full team from the original games. But then again, I find this game really fun when you play with a friend, and it's kind of how I remember this game the most, especially when it came to the minigames. And speaking of Pokemon, there was Pokemon Snap. Like Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, it wasn't the ideal Pokemon 3D experience I've had, but it's another relaxing game for me, as taking pictures of Pokemon in their natural habitats was cool, along with getting creative ways to find extra Pokemon to take pictures of. Fun fact, you can actually make stickers out of the pictures you take and bring them to, Then there was Hey You Pikachu, or as I like to call it, Hey You Wasted My Weekend, you I remember the advertisements claiming that this was the closest we have to owning your own Pokemon pet, well besides the pocket Pikachus. You could actually communicate with Pikachu and its surroundings. And geez Louise, this game was aggravatingly boring! Pikachu barely responded to a thing you said. Not helping was the fact that the game was only programmed with 200 English words in mind. Sadly, I can't show myself trying to communicate because I lack the VRU. While there was F-Zero X, which has probably the loosest control out of any of the games I've played, there didn't seem to be a Metroid game in development for this console. Wonder why. Now, one of the games I knew everybody played on the N64 was Super Smash Bros. It was one of the most unique fighting games for its time. There was no health meter, but there was a percentage counter and a life stock, and the controls were more akin to something you have in a platforming game than a typical fighting game. In this, you could play as all the famous Nintendo characters, though I was a little bit confused when I saw Captain Falcon and Ness. I mean, I did play F-Zero frequently on the Super Nintendo, but I wasn't aware that there were actual characters as opposed to the vehicles you could drive. And when it comes to Ness, I'd be lying if I said I knew who he was during the time. Everyone else I knew, and there is just something oddly fun about beating up your favorite Nintendo mascot. And that's one thing I definitely liked about the Nintendo 64, was just the multiplayer options. When it came to the multiplayer games, I kind of dabbled in and out, mostly with the Mario Party series, which also functioned as an ultimate friend breaker. You can play as any of the Mario characters, or at least the ones established for the time, and try to outluck each other in collecting coins and stars. During my childhood, I had access to all three of them, but now these days I only have three. And speaking of three, these were some of my favorite shooters on the console. GoldenEye follows the movie of the same name, or from what I've seen. It's where you can be Pierce Brosnan or any other Bond villain trying to bond each other. And then there was Perfect Dark, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is the first-person shooter where you can play co-op during the story mode. It is a better version of GoldenEye, believe it or not. And then there's Jet Force Gemini, which was more of a third-person shooter, but it was still so much fun fighting off space bugs with your friends. As for other fighting games on the N64, the options were rather sparse compared to what I had on other consoles at the time. No Street Fighter or any other Capcom fighting titles, but we had the likes of Mortal Kombat Trilogy, which, to be brutally honest, was not a really good game regardless which console you play this on. It was definitely one of those fighting games that focus on the biggest roster as opposed to the quality control, as these games have bugs galore. You know what, I'll save my further thoughts for MK Retrospective. But while we're talking about Mortal Kombat, 4 was the first 3D fighting game of the franchise, and while it hasn't really aged well, it's still serviceable. I mean, the controls are still pretty decent after all this time. It was probably the first out of the fighting games that was plot heavy, that includes cutscenes. And then there was Xena the Warrior Princess. My first initial thoughts was this was going to be an N64 version of the PS1 game, but instead it's a fighting game and a pretty average one at best. I don't know what's with the controls, but there's something that feels a bit janky with it, but it's not unplayable. The thing I remember the most about this game was the voice acting, which I gotta say there is no way this is anyone from the actual show voicing the characters. Overall, it's not a bad game, but it's nothing I would get excited over either. And then we have Powerpuff Girls Chemical Extraction. Graphically speaking, the characters look like how they should. There, I said all the good things about this game, but everything else, well, the best way I would describe it, say you combine Fighting Street, Street Combat, and Sonic Fighters, and thus, you have the perfect ingredients for a lousy fighter. Clearly the game designers didn't want anybody playing this. Most of the buttons feel like decoration, as only A, B, and Z does anything. Directions don't seem to matter because you just gravitate towards each other. It may look like I'm not even trying to fight back, but I'm pressing buttons and nothing is working. I have to hope in vain that the AI just stops attacking. And that's all this game really is. Luck. And tell me how come as a Powerpuff Girl I can beat villains like Princess or Mojo Jojo easily, but characters like Sedusa or anyone from the Green Gang are giving me such a hard time. You don't forget, I'm going back to Xena. As for other games that I rented, there was Mischief Makers, a rather interesting platforming game. I gotta say, it's a really challenging game, even when you get the mechanics down. It's not aggravatingly hard, but it'll definitely give you a run for your money. A lot of people would say this is a sleeper hit for the N64. It's definitely worth your time if you want to give it a try. Also, if you can 100% this game, you definitely deserve a reward. Similar to Xena earlier, a show I couldn't stop watching as a kid was Hercules: The Legendary Journey. Even when Disney made their own Hercules, I still couldn't stop watching these two shows. They were just that awesome. Too bad I really can't say the same thing for the Hercules video game on the N64. Now the first thing that caught me off guard as a kid was the music. Both Hercules and Xena had an awesome and appropriate soundtrack, but this sounds like something you would hear at a planetarium, or when you turn on an education game, this would be the menu music. And another thing that caught me by surprise is this game reminds me a lot of Ocarina of Time, and by that it is Ocarina of Time. I mean, this might as well just be an official ROM hack of Ocarina of Time when you think about it. And for being a knockoff of Zelda, it's actually not bad at all, but like the Xena game, it's really nothing to brag about, though I do love Hercules' running animation. And here we have Castlevania 64. Believe it or not, this was actually my first exposure into the Castlevania franchise, only to be followed up by Symphony of the Night. Going into this game for the first time, I had no expectation. I mean, when I saw it on the shelf at Blockbuster, all I saw was a guy with a whip, and I thought, hey, this looks like it could be cool. Oh, I was wrong! This is the most boring Castlevania game I played by far. The whipping controls are just plain awkward. There's times it looks like I should be hitting the enemies, but nope, not at all. When I'm playing as Carrie, it seems to be a little bit better, but it's not a huge improvement. She has spells that when you charge them, they can heat seek. That is good, but if you get hit while you're charging, you lose that charge. That's just fun. But the worst thing about this game has to be the camera angles. And you know how much I hate depth perception issues in a platforming game. If you ever need proof that Castlevania doesn't need to be in 3D outside the Lord of Shadow games, this is the best example. And I know there's Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, which is basically the director's cut version of this game, but considering how much I didn't like this game to begin with, I don't see myself owning a copy of that ever. And if you think that was my least favorite N64 game, well, here's Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero. An action platforming game based off of Mortal Kombat? Sounds awesome, right? In theory, this game uses Mortal Kombat physics, and not in the best way. You know how in fighting games you automatically turn to your opponent? Well, here, you have to manually turn to every enemy in the game. And jumping doesn't help either. No. And of course with that, you have to use up to jump. There's no other dedicated button to jump. But that's not even the worst of it. When you get past the basic enemies, you have to deal with instant death obstacles, such as these pillars. As a kid, I've never made it past this part ever, because you always have to be running to get past them, but even then, there are times that another one just pops in and Now I know people say that games like Daikatana or Superman 64 is the worst when it comes to the N64 games, but this is honestly the worst platformer I've ever played, bar none. One game I wanted to talk about for this video was Star Wars Rogue Squadron. It was a Star Wars game that had a little bit of its own series. You could play for the Rebels or for the Empire, where you could use Y-Wings, X-Wings, A-Wings, TIE Fighters, TIE Bombers. The possibilities seemed endless. Unfortunately though, when I was recording footage for this video, my copy seemed to stop working, so maybe for another day. But to end this video on a good note, the game I played the most out of on the N64 was Rayman 2. Now I played the original game on the PlayStation, and it was fun, even though I found the difficulty to be a bit overly punishing, but I'll save my thoughts about that for another day. Needless to say, I was excited for the sequel, and this game did not disappoint. As Mario defined 3D platforming, I think Rayman perfected it, well, at least on the console. Going around collecting TNCs, getting most of the lumps, and once again, an amazing soundtrack. What wasn't there to love? I mean, sure, it was story heavy, even more so than the first game, but I actually didn't mind it too much. It was released onto other consoles, including the Dreamcast, PlayStation 1, and PlayStation 2 with better frame rate. But honestly, this game controls best on the N64 to me. If you want an example of how to make a superior game sequel, Rayman 2 is one of those examples. So in conclusion, while the N64 is not the best that Nintendo has come out with, nor is it something that's particularly aged well after all these years, it's still a very nice console overall. And if you want to give the games a try and can't find the cartridges or the console, there's Rare Replay, which has quite a few of the N64 games on there. They actually work really well on the Xbox One. And there's also the Wii U Virtual Console that has quite a few of them as well, which is making me wonder when the Switch is going to jump on that. Come on! And if you're wondering, no, these should not count as reviews for any of these games. I just wanted to briefly talk about them, or specifically the ones I grew up with. And I also wanted to make this video in tribute to my mother, who unfortunately passed some time ago. And honest to goodness, if it wasn't for her, I probably wouldn't have this channel. And I definitely wouldn't have all the fun holiday memories without her. So for Mom, thank you. Thank you for all these great holiday things. But in the meantime, thank you again for watching this video, and I hope to see you soon. Have a great and happy holidays, and take care. Huh? What's this? That's odd. I thought I talked about everything. Did I miss something?
Things that bother you never bother me. I feel happy and fine. Ha ha! Living in the sunlight, loving in the moonlight, having a wonderful time.